tonight, Donald Trump says OPEC is ripping off the rest of the world. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, the U.S. president took his gripes about the oil cartel off of Twitter and presented them before the world's most powerful leaders. Mr. Trump swears he won't put up with, quote, horrible high oil prices much longer.
OPEC and OPEC nations are, as usual, ripping off the rest of the world. And I don't like it. Nobody should like it. We defend many of these nations for nothing, and then they take advantage of us by giving us high oil prices. Not good.
Okay, not good, but here's exactly who Trump is going after when he lambastes OPEC. 15 nations from the Middle East, Africa, and South America. It includes, of course, his friends, like Saudi Arabia, and, of course, some enemies like Venezuela and Iran. Combined, they control about 40% of the world's oil production. Now, oil prices are rallying as energy markets seem to be blowing off the president. Brent crude is pushing up to a 4-year high. OPEC appears to be in no rush to increase its output and give prices a break. Now, meantime, Donald Trump's decision to reimpose those sanctions on Iran certainly aren't helping. And our John Defterios is in London. And, you know, that's one of the contradictions here that many people point out, is to say, look, if Iran were allowed to come back into those oil markets, as was envisioned when they had that first deal with the European countries and the United States, of course, prices could be a little bit more depressed than they are right now.
Yeah, indeed, Paula. This is a lot about politics, particularly geopolitics and Iran. And President Trump keeps OPEC in his crosshairs, and the key producers and the OPEC Secretary General, in a word, are baffled. They said they would keep the market balanced, but they think it's Donald Trump driving up prices right now. There is, in fact, 3 key factors that are creating this perfect storm, driving us to that 4-year high that you're talking about. Yes, the pressure on Iran. The U.S., since they had the snapback sanctions and said they'll put them in place on energy November 4th, have knocked out 800,000 barrels of exports already. Number 2, Venezuela continues to collapse. 10 years ago, they're producing over 3 million barrels a day. In September, according to the latest OPEC report, that's 1.2 million barrels a day. And indeed, President Trump has a point here. Russia and Saudi Arabia, the 2 largest producers in that OPEC, non-OPEC agreement, are holding back production right now because they don't see the demand. They promised in the second half of the year they would add 1 million barrels a day. They're halfway there, but the Saudi oil minister, Khalid al-Faleh, said, look, until we get the orders from our customers, we're not going to put more oil on the market. They think it's self-inflicted by Donald Trump, putting the pressure on Iran. And they're also watching, Paula, the tariffs against China. It's a big importer of crude. They see if China slows down, those orders from Asia will slow down as well. So they're not eager to put the added oil onto the market to respond to the political pressure. And we have to not forget that Iran's a member of OPEC. So even though Saudi Arabia and Iran fight with each other over Yemen, for example, in that proxy war, they have to keep the good ties within the OPEC apparatus, that umbrella, working with the non-OPEC producer, Russia, as well.
Not one thing, because it serves both of their interests in both Saudi Arabia and Iran. John, we heard again, of course, from Mr. Rouhani, who was talking again about the U.S. posture towards Iran, trying to point out some of the contradictions. I want you to listen now to him speaking to our own Christiana Mampour.
When it comes to only expressing their political will and aims, they have been quite resolute in making those announcements, which consisted of them saying that we wish to safeguard the JCPOA. But in reality, in a tangible fashion, our expectations have not been met. What the Europeans announce, what they say today, if they can put it into practice, of course the JCPOA will remain as such, and we will be able to, without the presence of the United States of America, continue with this agreement.
John, what he's talking about there is highly significant, and that is the fact that Europe would get to keep its deal on the nuclear deal with Iran and continue to do business with Iran, even if the United States doesn't like it. Operationally, John, from what you've seen in the last few weeks, because it was the Germans who brought this up in the first place, can it work?
Well, this is the Hassan Rouhani show me the money moment, I think, Paula. He's saying, let's go beyond the platitudes. If you read between the lines of what he had to say to the Europeans, take a step back. These are the 5 signatory countries beyond the United States. They're trying to work out a political deal and have the economics work at the same time. They're talking about a barter working around the U.S. dollar and trying to keep up the exports for Iran. There's a harsh reality here. If I'm a Total or BP or Shell and I have exposure to the United States, either with shareholders or with orders right now, or a big trading commodities group, I wouldn't touch this with a barge pole. I'd have the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve all over me. So here's the math. 2.8 million barrels of exports in June, according to the oil minister, who told me that at OPEC, 800,000 being knocked out. There's 2 million left over. Is it realistic to think that the U.S. will knock out another 1 million barrels of exports from Iran by the snapback sanctions deadline in November? Yes. Are they going to likely keep about 1 million barrels a day of production? I would think so. That's what they had when they had the sanctions under the nuclear agreement. For humanitarian purposes, the European Union, the other signatories, want to protect that for Iran. Donald Trump's trying to knock it down to zero, and I don't think that's going to be possible.
Yeah, and knocking it down to zero, he's hoping will put not just economic pressure, but political pressure on Iran. John Victorious laying out those issues quite succinctly. I appreciate it because it's getting complicated. Thanks so much.
Very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. Now.